I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. Undoubtedly, mental health is one of the great challenges of our generation. From young children to elderly retirees, mental well-being has, it seems, never been harder to achieve. And it doesn't discriminate, cutting across all genders, races and socio-economic backgrounds. Our guest this morning is a person who's been a successful business leader, worked with huge corporations, led workforces, and has also suffered from poor mental health. Former ad executive, author of several books, including Middle-Aged Man in Rehab, and now mental wellbeing guide, Mike Morrison. Welcome to Fear and Greed.
Sean, I'm well, and listen, it's great. I'm delighted to have an invitation to be able to speak.
Tell me your story, Mike.
Sean, I've suffered depression and bipolar 2 for about 350,000 hours of my life. So it's been something which has been a constant presence within my life. However, there was a time in which I was the former chief sales officer of Network 10 and chief strategy officer of Y&R on global duties. And needless to say, I masked that condition, let's say successfully, for decades. It's something in which my life looked fantastic on paper. However, much of it was a deeply troubling way to live, and it was incredibly morbid.
You know, media and advertising, when you talk about high-flying execs, you picture the Mad Men image of that type of media advertising. For you, what was it like to live with it? Could you admit to it? I mean, obviously it took you a while to admit to it.
Yeah, it was like you were in between the trapeze every day. The highs in advertising were very high and the lows were very low. When I was at 10, I had to get 70 million a month in sales at a time in which the network was troubled. And as a result of that, you lived with a lot of fear, and it was also just exhausting. There are 3 components to depression. It's exhaustion, worthlessness, and sadness. So it's not just simply sadness. And I masked it because I was never confident at all that I was able to be open in a way in which it would be received in a healthy fashion. I always thought that I might be the weak link, or in fact that I'd be professionally prejudiced as a result of admitting this particular set of conditions.
So what was the moment that changed it for you, that made you decide that you needed to do something about it?
I think there's a point where you become so frustrated, not just with the lack of productivity, but you become frustrated with how you're feeling all the time. And I decided in 2017 that I would actually stop working and devote that year to my health. And in so doing, decided to admit myself to a facility, which for 3 weeks I was able to attend to depression. I was able to attend to alcohol, and it was a multidisciplinary approach then for 3 weeks. That became a real watermark in my life because I was able to then look at brain health, mental health, and physical health, and try and redesign a new life that would be a lot more satisfying than the one that I'd been living before, which it wasn't that I was living a lie. It's just that I was being successful while feeling deeply unsuccessful.
It's very difficult, and I think particularly for men who get so much self-worth out of work, and I'll put myself in this category, to actually say, I'm struggling because if I didn't have work, I have kids, but what about me? That must be a real challenge for all people, but particularly men.
Yes, indeed, because our identity is so sewn together in terms of what we do, who we work for, as opposed to how you're feeling and how you are as a human being. So hi, it can be, hi, I'm Mike Morrison, from Y&R, or I was Mike Morrison from Channel 10, etc. And they became inextricably linked. Now, when you take that away, or you begin to focus on some feelings which are very uncomfortable, it's a very troubling period. And so what I try to do now is help organisations and individuals become very comfortable with uncomfortable feelings and uncomfortable conditions that are in the workplace.
You went to the facility for 3 weeks and you kind of reassessed and got help, which I think is really critical that people do get help. Yep. So what's happened since then, since 2017?
Well, I've set up a circle of care. That means that I have one good friend that I confide in, not a colleague, because I was always concerned that a colleague might, in fact, actually almost betray my trust. But I've got one good friend that I confide in. I've also then got a good GP, and a good GP is someone who I think recommends non-medical treatment for you. I've got a good psychologist, and I've got a good mentor. So they're the four people in my circle of care which I really rely on. The other thing is that one of the key foundations to good mental health is brain health. Now, that is not always obvious to people, but brain health is absolutely central. So, in fact, things like diet, gut, and sleep are absolutely central to having your brain in healthy working order, and as a result, your mind will be in better working order as well.
So it's diet, gut, and sleep. Diet, I certainly get. Sleep, I certainly get. What do you mean by gut?
There's a vagus nerve that runs between your gut and your brain. It's like a biodynamic highway, and it's a nervous system pathway in which really good gut health, in fact, actually promotes really good brain health. And as a result of that, it's called nutritional psychiatry, and this is the leading edge of where most mental health treatment now is beginning to entertain, and that is the role of diet with regard to reducing inflammation in your brain and your gut. Inflammation is excess protein, and that can diminish the brain nerve endings and as a result reduce some of the hormones like dopamine and serotonin. So there is a physiological component to mental health which is now being, acted upon and understood more.
Mike, stay with me. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Mike Morrison, Mental Wellbeing Guide. Now, if you bring it into the COVID world and then the post-COVID world, interestingly, John Brogden, the chair of Lifeline, wrote in one of the media outlets recently that there wasn't actually a spike in suicides during COVID, which they had expected, which he was saying was a very, obviously is a very positive outcome. How do you think COVID has affected, particularly in relation to mental health in the workforce?
I think there's a rise in corporate loneliness. There's a rise in loneliness generally, and loneliness is physiologically just as diminishing to someone as if they're undertaking, any sort of physical diminishing behaviour. And the reason why loneliness is so important is because loneliness is not I'm on my own. Loneliness is I'm on my own and nobody cares that I'm on my own. That's why there are people who can feel lonely whilst they are at work in a crowd of people, in a Zoom call, etc. So I think the rise of loneliness and isolation has been one of the artifacts of COVID. And that goes to some of the work that I do now is to consult to companies on the 5 keys of good mental health in the workplace. And I then get around to loneliness because that's a deeply personal condition, and one which also has a stigma attached to it, that if you're thought to be lonely, you're thought to be deficient in some way, that you are unpopular. And therefore, if you're unpopular, that doesn't bode well in today's society that values popularity.
So what are the 5 tenets?
One thing I do is I identify, the first thing is to identify catastrophe language. And I was guilty of this. Catastrophe language is where you say, we must get this done, or here's the consequence, or we must win this business, or whatever. And it's a very over-emotive, inflammatory and colourful way to be able to try and get staff to do things. And that catastrophe language elevates the cortisol levels of staff, so it makes them tired. Elevated cortisol levels then mean, in fact, actually your people are stressed beyond competency. And catastrophe language is something which we identify, and then there are ways in which to be able to neutralise that in the workplace by simply being more moderate and realistic. Then, in fact, no, not everyone's going to die and the company's not going to go under if we don't meet this deadline.
Yeah.
The other is to identify cultural saboteurs. Now, they're people who know what's right to do in an organisation, but they need a bit of coaching because they're almost selfish about their own actions. They don't understand how collective productivity is better, and it's the cheapest way to be able to improve benefits for the business. And at the same time, identify all your black light leaders. Black lights are those things that reveal the hidden. And there's all sorts of leaders in the business who have influence and gravitas, but don't put their hand up and say, I'm a leader, I'm a boss, look at me. They're very important to be able to create what I call strong cultures in organisations. And a strong culture is not tough. A strong culture is not about aggressiveness. It's about knowing what true strength is. There's a lot of after-dark bullying that goes on. In France, you can't receive an email once you leave the workplace. However, in Australia, it appears that you can still work somebody to death, even after they've left the workplace, via getting them on their phones, etc. And that really just breeds resentment, and it breeds distrust from the employee back to the employer.
That must be a big one in COVID times, simply because we are all working from home, and it's really hard to finish at 5 o'clock.
It is. So, my suggestion to people is that what you try and do is work out green time in your diary. And that might be, in fact, actually getting up earlier is where there is a lot of unused time. I've got an unusual day. My day begins the night before. At 7:30, there are no phones, no booze, nothing like that. 8:30, I'm in bed. 4:30, I get up. And then I have an eyes back moment, eyes down, and then eyes forward throughout the day till about 3 o'clock, which I find myself being at my most productive. So I operate hopefully in a more disciplined fashion as a result.
So can you unpack that, the 3 eyes? I like that idea.
Yeah, the eyes back is to review what I've done. And that's and I do that at 4:30, where I'm able to read in quiet, review what I've done, and examine what progress I may or may not have made. The eyes down is where I'm really reading and writing, and I might be in meetings, and I might be in a period where I have to concentrate and I'm with other people. And the eyes forward is when I get towards the end of the day around 3 o'clock, where I'm looking at planning either a day ahead, weeks or months ahead. And that is a way of me being able to lift my eyes up from the day. And it's called weeding the day. What you do is you actually look at all the good things that have happened during the day, and you note those and you write those down. Because journaling aids neuroplasticity. What you're writing down actually writes neuroplasticity within your brain and creates good habits like that. So that's how I try and work, allowing obviously for interruptions. Like I've got a 15-year-old daughter, so there's always going to be interruptions, and life interrupts. But that keeps me to a better schedule, and I find myself a lot more productive. And I find evenings very much become more family time for people. So they're the ones that managers have got to work around when it comes to dealing with people that are working from home.
What we're talking about is a very individual thing. If I'm a manager of a workforce, what is it that I should be thinking about in terms of, you can't look after the mental well-being of every individual, but you can certainly set up a culture that encourages sort of better mental health.
That's exactly right. And one of the other things to think about as a manager is the rise of the unsaid policies. They're policies in cultures that are known by a few really to maintain control, and it's not really that transparent. So if you see those within your workplace, and they can be identified, and the key thing here is to undertake a mental health audit, which is what I do with organisations, and we go through that and we say, well, listen, are there patterns in your email and your communication which are sharp objects to people's mental health? Now, something as simple as that. So catastrophe language and identifying saboteurs, identifying after dark work, say unsaid policies and patterns in email, those 5 things neutralise a workplace and create a strong one. And I've been in organisations that have been at the extremes of all of those, not in a good way.
I'm sure everyone listening has had an email arrive at 1 a.m. or an email that says this has to be done by lunchtime.
Yes.
And it actually just irritates you, or it irritates me.
Well, yeah, elevates. First of all, there's a physiological reaction, elevates your heart rate, elevates cortisol. Then you resent it. Then you think about all the things I've got to sacrifice in order to make that happen. Yep. And then if it's determined that it's not a real deadline, then that breeds distrust. Now, I've done that to people, and that's happened to me as well. That's not the way strong cultures can grow.
We'll be back with more in a moment. My guest today is mental wellbeing guide Mike Morrison. So you do a cultural audit or a health audit.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone in every workplace would identify some of these catastrophe language, cultural saboteurs, that like leaders, that type of thing.
Yeah.
What next? How do you change it?
Well, the fact that you become aware of it allows you to deal with what you think are the most important things. And they're not weighted evenly. Those 5 things I don't weight evenly. We find the ones that are, we think, I suppose, derailing a good culture, and begin to concentrate on those first. I mean, there may be companies that have got into habits, and these habits may be to use catastrophe language, particularly in sales and deadlines businesses. Then you might have more, surreptitious, unsaid policies in which some leaders in the business, some heavyweights in the business really know what's going on, and yet they don't think that it's appropriate then to be able to tell staff. So that becomes a communication issue, and you've got to be able to weight that accordingly. So you can timetable these into your business, not to expect changes overnight, but to be able to signal to staff that we've identified these And the cheapest way to get greater productivity out of an organisation in the COVID commerce era is to be able to address things like mental health, because it's not as costly as you think to be able to change culture.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the next 12 months, what you're talking about, I'm sure will be more and more prevalent, even as people shift back to work, because again, we've all become used to working from home, but having to get back into the workplace, that'll cause a lot of trials and tribulations as well.
Well, you've got presenteeism occurring at out-of-home work. And that presenteeism basically is I'm tired, but I'm okay and I'm still presenting to work. Now, the World Health Organization regards the loss of productivity as epic tiredness and forgetfulness at work. So there is presenteeism in out-of-home work as much as there is presenteeism when you are on premise. So in order for you to be able to make arguably a material change in the productivity of your business is to be able to address the things which are largely unsaid, or the things which are being paid lip service to, like Apple's 3-minute massages and yoga mats. That's not well-being. All right, that is lip service, that is wallpaper. And I think people are seeing past that now, that true well-being is in being able to bring your whole self to work and create an authentic culture. An authentic culture means you don't need to put on an avatar in order to go to work. I'm the tough executive, I'm the creative executive, I'm the bully, I'm the star. They're all avatars people feel that they need to put on in order to exist in that culture and survive. That becomes a problem. And what I try and do is neutralise that.
I think it's going to be a very challenging 2021, I suspect. I mean, just listening to what you're talking about, there's going to be all these challenges that people haven't come up against. Are there any organisations that you've seen globally who actually do a pretty good job at this?
There are organisations, funnily enough, in the tech sector, and by this I'm actually talking about some hardware organisations that I know of, in which there's obviously been some sort of personal epiphany at senior leadership level. And they have then decided that the way in which they've been very one-dimensional in their management style, therefore that's manifested itself in terms of the culture. And they have decided to be more accepting of people who have either these conditions, and 25% of your workforce has a mental health condition. And they've tried to attend to that. I think the infantilization of the workforce or workplace, where you turn your foyer into something that looks like a child's playground, is not dealing with, it doesn't create creativity, firstly. It doesn't deal with an authentic culture, and people feel they've got to create an avatar in order to go to work. Now, we see the rise of things like chief mental health officers, mental health first aid, and these are all good first steps. The jury's out on a lot of virtual mental health tools, because I believe that whilst they are part of a solution, it's the human interaction. If you're sitting there with a senior male executive, say in a professional services firm, he doesn't want to feel that he's going to be professionally embarrassed or humiliated at all. And therefore, building trust becomes the key thing in order to be able to get that executive to think through how he could manage in a more positive and a healthy fashion. And now that takes a bit more than a virtual health tool.
Yeah, so much to think about. Mike, thank you very much. I mean, we'll keep in touch as the year goes on, if you don't mind, because there's so much to unpack in this conversation that it would be great to check in. For people interested, mikemorrison.com.au, is that right?
It's Michael Morrison, so it's Michael. Chael, Morrison, Morrison. .com.au. Yeah, give me a bell and have a chat. There is always lots to talk about. And Sean, of course, I'd love to check in as this new year of 2021 unfolds.
Mike, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Not at all.
That was Mike Morrison, Mental Wellbeing Guide from michaelmorrison.com.au.